My name is Robert Milson. I'm 41 years old, and I never thought I'd be the type of guy sharing a story like this. You know the kind. Those anonymous posts you read online about betrayals that seem too crazy to be real. I always thought they were exaggerated or made up for entertainment. I thought, that'll never happen to me. But here I am. And let me tell you, life has a way of humbling you when you least expect it. It all started about a month ago. Carla, my wife of just over a year and a half, began acting different. Now, I'm not the type to jump to conclusions. People go through rough patches, especially when they're under stress, and Carla's job as a project manager at a marketing firm was no joke. Tight deadlines, demanding clients, it wasn't easy for her. I chalked up her distant behavior to work stress at first, but something just didn't sit right. She was colder, more distant. It wasn't just the typical long day at work exhaustion. This was something deeper. Conversations that used to flow naturally now felt strained. Small things, like the way she used to smile when I'd bring her coffee in the morning, were gone. I noticed that she was spending more time on her phone, too, always angling the screen away from me. She'd step outside to take calls and come back with vague explanations like, "Oh, that was Clara from work." I wanted to believe her, but I'd seen this pattern before. My first marriage had ended when my ex-wife's late nights at work turned out to be something else entirely. The similarities between then and now made my stomach churn. Carla and I have been together for about 4.5 years. When we first started dating, it felt like we were perfect for each other. She was supportive, kind, and we had this natural chemistry that made everything feel easy. When we got married, I thought I'd finally found the partner I could grow old with. But now, as I looked at her, I barely recognized the person I married. The change wasn't sudden. It crept up on me gradually, like a shadow you don't notice until it's right behind you. At first, it was little things. Her pulling away when I tried to hug her, her lack of interest in spending time together, her constant excuses for why she couldn't talk about her day. But as the weeks went on, it became more obvious. She seemed completely disinterested in our relationship, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little sense it made. We'd gone through tough times before, money troubles, disagreements about work-life balance, but we always found our way back to each other. This was different. It wasn't just distance. It felt like she didn't care anymore. The breaking point came one night around midnight. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when Carla got up, grabbed her phone, and started getting dressed. "Where are you going?" I asked, groggily sitting up. "Clara called," she said, not looking at me. "She was in a car accident. I need to go help her." That woke me up. What? Why can't someone else go? Her family, maybe? Carla sighed, clearly annoyed. "Robert, I'm her closest friend. She needs me right now." The whole thing felt off. Carla had always been good about explaining things before. Where she was going, why, when she'd be back. But this time, she was cagey. She didn't even tell me where the accident had happened or what kind of help Clara needed. "Carla," I said, trying to keep my tone calm, "are you sure this is the whole story? Something doesn't feel right about this." Her head snapped toward me, and her eyes flashed with anger. "Are you serious right now? Clara's in trouble, and you're sitting here questioning me like I'm doing something wrong? God, you're so insensitive sometimes." She grabbed her bag and stormed out before I could say anything else. That night, I lay awake for hours, replaying the argument in my head. Her reaction had been so defensive, so over the top, that it felt like she was trying to hide something. The next morning, when Carla got home, I tried to talk to her about it. I wanted to understand what was going on, to give her the benefit of the doubt. But the conversation turned into a full-blown argument. "You don't trust me," she said, crossing her arms. "That's the problem here. You always have to control everything." "I'm not trying to control you, Carla," I replied. "But you're acting differently, and I can't ignore that. I feel like there's something you're not telling me." Her response was vague and dismissive, and by the end of the argument, I felt more confused than ever. But one thing was clear. Something was definitely wrong. After that fight, Carla became even more distant. She stopped sharing details about her day altogether and started spending more time away from home. I tried to give her space, thinking maybe she just needed time to sort things out. But deep down, I knew better. I decided it was time to take matters into my own hands. Trust is the foundation of any marriage, and once it's broken, it's hard to rebuild. I didn't want to assume the worst, but I couldn't just sit back and let this continue. The first thing I did was check her work laptop. It wasn't something I'd ever done before, and honestly, it felt wrong. But Carla had left it on the kitchen counter, and my curiosity got the better of me. I opened her email, her calendar, and even her project management app, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain her behavior. But there was nothing. No suspicious emails, no meetings that didn't add up, no clues at all. If Carla was hiding something, she wasn't using her work laptop to do it. At that point, I knew I needed a different approach. I decided to start paying closer attention to her schedule and her excuses. Where was she going? Who was she spending time with? It wasn't about being controlling. It was about protecting myself. If she was being unfaithful, I needed to know. What I didn't realize was just how far down the rabbit hole this situation would go. Let's just say that when the truth finally came out, it wasn't just my marriage that broke. It was also someone else's plumbing. When Carla's behavior became too suspicious to ignore, I knew I had to do something. Confronting her directly hadn't worked. Every conversation turned into an argument where she either dismissed my concerns or accused me of being controlling. I wasn't about to let this go unresolved. I'm not the kind of man who likes to pry or invade someone's privacy, but at that point, what choice did I have? Carla's secrecy and her constant absences were driving me insane. If she wasn't going to give me the truth, I'd have to find it myself. That's when I made the decision to track her movements. After some research, I decided on 2 GPS trackers, one for her car and one for her phone. I figured if she was up to something, these devices would give me the answers I needed. Installing the car tracker was easy enough. I placed it underneath her car late one night while she was asleep. As for the phone tracker, that required a bit more finesse. Before proceeding, I decided to consult my lawyer to make sure I wasn't crossing any legal lines. Technically, you can track her movements, he said, but there's a catch. If this goes to court, you'll need to show that you didn't violate her privacy in ways that could backfire on you. I'd recommend using a private investigator instead. It'll keep things cleaner and give you more credible evidence if it comes to that. The thought of hiring a private investigator hadn't crossed my mind, but the lawyer was right. I needed solid evidence, and I didn't want Carla or anyone else twisting my actions to make me look like the bad guy. Within a day, I was in contact with a private investigator named Daniel. He had years of experience handling situations like mine, and he assured me he'd get to the bottom of it. "Give me a week," he said. "If there's anything to find, I'll find it." It didn't even take a week. The very next day, Carla stormed out of the house after yet another argument. She claimed she was going to see her friend Clara again, which had become her go-to excuse for everything. Daniel had already planted his own tracker on her car, so I called him immediately. "She's on the move," I said. "I've got it," he replied. I waited anxiously, pacing the living room as Daniel followed her. About an hour later, he called back. She drove to Clara's place, stayed for 5 minutes, then left. Now she's at a restaurant on the other side of town. "What kind of restaurant?" I asked. "High-end. Not exactly the kind of place you'd go to just grab a quick bite with a friend." My stomach dropped. Something told me this was it. This was the moment where everything I suspected would finally come to light. "Can you check it out?" I asked Daniel. "Already on it," he said. About 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. It included 2 photos. The first showed Carla sitting at a table with a man I didn't recognize. He looked to be in his mid-40s, dressed sharply in a tailored suit. They weren't sitting across from each other like colleagues might. They were side by side, leaning in close. The second photo was worse. It captured the exact moment the man leaned in to kiss Carla. She didn't pull away. I stared at the photos, my hands trembling with anger and disbelief. I don't know what I'd expected to find, but seeing it so plainly, so undeniably, still felt like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't work stress or a rough patch in our marriage. This was betrayal, plain and simple. Daniel called me again a few minutes later. "Do you want me to keep following them?" "Yes," I said, my voice cold. "I need to know where they're going." While I waited for updates, I sat down on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. Was it my fault? Had I done something to push her away? Or was this just who Carla really was? No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the anger kept bubbling to the surface. I had given Carla everything, my time, my love, my trust. And this was how she repaid me? About an hour later, Daniel called back. They left the restaurant and drove to his place. He lives in a gated community about 15 minutes from the restaurant. They went inside about 20 minutes ago. Did you get photos of the house? Of course, Daniel said. I'll send them to you now. A moment later, my phone buzzed with more photos. The house was exactly what I'd expected: large, expensive, and cold. It seemed fitting for the man who was tearing my marriage apart. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to make sense of it all. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was no sense to be made. Carla had made her choice, and now I had to decide how to respond. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to throw the evidence in her face and demand an explanation. But another part of me knew that wasn't the right move, not yet. The next day, I called Daniel again. Keep watching them, I said. I need to know how far this goes. Carla didn't suspect a thing. She went about her day as if nothing had happened, completely unaware that her lies were unraveling. But I knew, and soon, so would she. When Daniel, the private investigator, called me with an update, I was sitting at my desk, staring blankly at my laptop. They've arrived at a country house, he said. It's pretty spacious, definitely not a modest rental or anything like that. Looks like it belongs to the guy. Send me the address, I replied immediately. You sure you want to do this, Robert? He asked cautiously. Confrontations can get messy. I'm sure, I said firmly. As I hung up, I felt a storm brewing inside me. Anger, betrayal, and a deep sense of humiliation collided, making it nearly impossible to think straight. I called my lawyer next, needing to know whether this confrontation would have any legal repercussions. It's a bad idea, the lawyer said flatly after I explained the situation. If you show up uninvited and things escalate, it could backfire on you. Emotionally, I understand why you want to do it, but legally, it's risky. But this isn't just some random hunch, I argued, gripping the phone tightly. I have evidence. Photos, geolocation data. She's at a house that isn't hers, with a man who isn't me. This is my wife, and I deserve answers. Robert, I get it, he said, his tone softening. But think about the bigger picture. You're already gathering everything you need for a strong case. Confronting them in person might jeopardize that. I thanked him for his advice, but I'd already made up my mind. This wasn't just about the legalities anymore. This was about standing up for myself, about not letting them get away with this. On the drive to the address Daniel sent me, I had too much time to think. Memories of my relationship with Carla flooded my mind. Our first date, the way she used to laugh at my terrible jokes, the day we moved into our home together. I couldn't help but wonder where it had all gone wrong. Was there something I could have done differently? Or was this just who Carla was all along? As I gripped the steering wheel, my jaw tightened. No, this wasn't my fault. Whatever had led her to this point was her choice, not mine. I called Daniel to let him know I was on my way. You can stop watching them, I said. I'll handle it from here. Be careful, he replied. When I arrived at the house, it was even larger than I'd imagined. A sprawling two-story property, surrounded by tall trees and set back from the road. It reeked of wealth and privilege, exactly the kind of place you'd expect a guy like Carla's lover to own. I parked a short distance away and took a deep breath. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to focus. I called my lawyer one last time, letting him know I was there. Robert, this is your final warning. Turn around and go home, he said. I can't, I replied. I need to see this through. I stepped out of the car and approached the house. As I got closer, I noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. For a moment, I hesitated. Breaking into someone's home was crossing a line, even for me. But then I thought about Carla, about all the lies, the deceit, the audacity it took for her to lead this double life. I pushed the door open. The interior of the house was pristine, with sleek furniture and expensive decor that screamed, "successful businessman." I could hear muffled voices and laughter coming from upstairs. My stomach churned as I made my way toward the sound. Each step felt heavier than the last. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to keep going. This was it, the moment of truth. When I reached the top of the stairs, I followed the voices to a partially open door at the end of the hallway. I paused, taking one last deep breath before pushing the door open. Inside, I saw Carla and her lover sitting on the edge of the bed, wrapped in an embrace. They froze the moment they saw me, their faces a mix of shock and panic. "What the, Robert?" Carla stammered, her voice trembling. Her lover, who looked even more pathetic in person than I'd imagined, let out a yelp of pain as he jolted upright. In his panic, he stumbled backward, knocking over a small table that sent a glass of water crashing to the floor. Carla, startled by his sudden movement, fell off the edge of the bed, landing with a loud thud. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, my voice cold and steady. "You've been caught. Both of you." The room descended into chaos. Her lover clutched his side, wincing dramatically as if I'd hit him, though I hadn't even touched him. Carla scrambled to her feet, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Robert, this isn't what it looks like," she blurted out. I laughed bitterly. "Isn't what it looks like? Carla, you're in another man's house, in his bedroom, with him. What part of this am I misunderstanding?" Her lover, still clutching his side, tried to step forward. "Look, man, I think we should all just calm down." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "You don't get to say a word." He stepped back, visibly intimidated. Carla's composure crumbled. "Please, Robert, just let me explain." "Explain what?" I snapped. "How you've been lying to me for months. How you've been sneaking around while I sat at home wondering what I did wrong." "Go ahead, Carla, explain." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I turned to leave, but as I stepped toward the door, I heard a sudden rush of water. Confused, I glanced back and saw her lover frantically fumbling with a small pipe near the corner of the room, apparently trying to fix the table he'd knocked over. "What are you doing?" Carla hissed at him. "I think I broke something," he whispered back, panicking. Water began to pool around the floor, spilling out faster than either of them could stop it. Carla's face turned bright red as she scrambled to help him, slipping in the process and landing flat on her back. The sight would have been funny if the situation weren't so infuriating. "Congratulations," I said, shaking my head. "You've officially ruined more than just our marriage." I left the house that day without another word. As I walked back to my car, the adrenaline started to wear off, and the weight of everything hit me all at once. The sight of Carla scrambling on the floor, her lover fumbling with the broken pipe as water flooded the room. It was absurd, almost laughable. But there was nothing funny about what had happened to my marriage. When I got home, the house was eerily quiet. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at nothing for what felt like hours. My phone buzzed a few times. Text from Carla, no doubt, but I didn't check them. What could she possibly say to fix this? That night, I called my lawyer again and told him everything that had happened. "You went there?" he asked, his tone exasperated. "I did," I admitted. "I know it wasn't the smartest move, but I needed to see it for myself." He sighed. "All right. Well, the good news is you didn't escalate things. The bad news is that this is going to be messy. Are you ready for that?" I wasn't. But what choice did I have? The divorce proceedings started the following week, and they were just as brutal as my lawyer had warned. Carla, of course, tried to spin the story in her favor. She claimed I had been emotionally distant, that I'd invaded her privacy, that our marriage had been falling apart for years. Her lawyer was relentless, painting me as controlling and paranoid. But I had the evidence, the photos, the texts, the timeline of her lies, and it was hard for her to argue against cold, hard facts. Still, the process dragged on for weeks. Every meeting, every document, every hearing felt like a fresh wound. And the worst part? It wasn't just about dividing assets or assigning blame. It was about the kids. We didn't have children together, but Carla had been close with my teenage daughter from my first marriage, Emma. Watching Emma's heartbreak over the situation was almost too much to bear. She'd looked up to Carla, trusted her, and now that trust was shattered. I tried to shield Emma from the worst of it, but she wasn't stupid. She knew something had happened, and she wasn't shy about voicing her anger. "I hate her," she said one night, her voice trembling. "How could she do this to us?" I didn't have an answer. For weeks later, the divorce was finalized. Carla got a small settlement, but most of what she tried to claim was denied thanks to the evidence I'd provided. The judge saw through her excuses and lies, granting me sole ownership of the house and sparing me from paying spousal support. It was a victory on paper, but it didn't feel like one. After the dust settled, I found myself alone in a house that felt far too big and far too empty. The silence was suffocating, and no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, work, hobbies, spending time with Emma, I couldn't escape the gnawing sense of failure. I started questioning everything. Had I been too focused on work? Too inattentive? Too trusting? Or was I just bad at relationships? For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd somehow brought this on myself. I replayed every argument, every red flag I'd ignored, every moment where I could have done something differently. It didn't matter that Carla had made her own choices, that she'd been the one to betray me. In the end, I was the one left picking up the pieces. Emma was my saving grace during that time. She'd come home from school and insist on watching movies or playing board games, anything to keep me from wallowing. "You're not allowed to give up," she said one night as we sat on the couch. "You're stronger than this, Dad." I smiled weakly, but her words stayed with me. Slowly, I started to rebuild. I threw myself into work, focused on being the best father I could be, and even started going to therapy. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the sadness and anger felt overwhelming, but I kept going. As for Carla, I heard through mutual acquaintances that things hadn't gone well for her after the divorce. Her relationship with her colleague didn't last long, and she ended up moving to a smaller apartment in another part of town. I didn't feel any satisfaction in her downfall. If anything, it just made me sad. Looking back, I've come to terms with what happened. Carla's betrayal was a painful lesson, but it forced me to reevaluate what I want in a relationship and what I deserve. I'm not perfect, and I'll always carry the scars from this experience. But I'm stronger now, and I know that I'll never settle for anything less than honesty and respect. Life goes on, and so do I.